I'm Adam Tomasi with Champion Briefs, and I'll be giving the November-December topic analysis for Resolved, the United States ought to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels. We've put together an excellent brief with great cards on both sides of this timely and important topic, and I encourage you to get your hands on it to prepare you for these upcoming debates over the next 2 months. So the topic, while it seems to be very simple and succinct, there's a lot to unpack. For instance, the resolution says the United States and not the United States federal government. This means that the affirmative has the leeway to argue that the entire country, federal and state governments, local governments aren't involved in these subsidy decisions because they're too small. But federal and state governments should be acting in concert to end fossil fuel subsidies, or if we imagine that tomorrow fossil fuel subsidies in every locale of the United States just stopped existing. Of course, the resolution says eliminate, which means that the affirmative can't just argue that we need to tinker around with the subsidy question and say, well, if we reduce subsidies and maintain them in a smaller form, the affirmative wouldn't be able to do that. But you do have the leeway as the affirmative, unless you disagree with allowing for specific plans, the ability to say that some subsidies should be eliminated even as others are kept, which I'll talk about with affirmative ideas, because there are many different types of fossil fuel subsidies. So I could see an affirmative saying that some types should be eliminated, and that's their position. But it certainly would not be affirmative ground to say that we should reduce fossil fuel subsidies by 50% of their dollar amount, like a $500 million reduction. You have to say that at least some subsidies for fossil fuels should no longer exist. So fossil fuels are coal, oil, and natural gas, as commonly understood. These are sources of energy that are dug up from the ground based upon the fossilized carbon content of long since dead plant life that has hardened up in the ground and is then extracted for its ability to be turned into oil, gas, coal, etc., whether you're mining it or you're drilling it from a well. And the reason why fossil fuels contribute to climate change is because the burning of them releases carbon dioxide emissions or releases methane or a variety of other greenhouse gases in the production process, but also in its consumption. So not only are there emissions from the extraction of oil to produce gasoline, but then also the burning of said gasoline in your car. And of course, carbon emissions come from all different sectors, virtually every sector of the economy, not virtually every sector of the economy has some contribution to climate change. And currently, transportation is actually the largest contributor in the United States and not production. And that was just because of a transition over time to cheaper natural gas, which has led to lower carbon dioxide emissions. But of course, there are valid critiques of the use of natural gas as what people call a bridge fuel or an interim step toward renewables. This topic kind of gets at the core of whether we ought to accelerate the transition to a 100% clean energy future versus this all of the above energy policy where we subsidize renewables and we subsidize fossil fuels. The fossil fuels are definitely subsidized to a significantly larger extent than renewable energy, and any sources you find that say that renewables actually get more money are quite wrong, because these are often from the same people that say that the fossil fuel industry does not get any subsidies at all, because the definition of what counts as a subsidy is kind of shaky. So it's not like the federal government just hands the fossil fuel industry billions of dollars to do whatever they want. It's rather a series of tax breaks and other discounts that enable fossil fuel production to be profitable, and hence the state supports it in a variety of different ways. So there was a study from the International Monetary Fund which said that the total amount of fossil fuel subsidies in the world is $5.2 trillion worldwide. That number is large because they include the fact that fossil fuel companies are not paying for the social and environmental costs of their pollution from greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the broadest definition of a subsidy to suggest that so long as emissions are untaxed, the emissions are being subsidized. I would say that the resolution, when it's talking about subsidies for fossil fuels, is talking about the production. So it would not be topical for the affirmative to say we ought to have a carbon tax because we are indirectly subsidizing the costs of emissions. Instead, you're saying that we're subsidizing the cost of production of fossil fuels, and that needs to end. So David Roberts from Vox cites a study by Oil Change International, which has a far more limited estimate of the amount of subsidies directly given for production coming from the United States, and says that in 2017, the US awarded, quote, $14.7 billion in federal subsidies and $5.8 billion in state level incentives for a total of $20.5 billion annually in corporate welfare. So the affirmative is arguing that these production subsidies need to end, even as the polluter pays principle is not being applied. And certainly the negative can say that just by ending subsidies, the affirmative does not lead to this sea change in the energy market or significant emissions reductions because they're not implementing a more wide-scale program like emissions trading or a carbon tax or banning fossil fuel production, keeping it in the ground, and so forth. The Environmental and Energy Study Institute actually has a pretty solid list of all of the tax breaks that the United States, both federal and state governments, give the fossil fuel industry. So remember that subsidies are ultimately tax breaks, not just a sack of money given to the companies, at least in the United States. So there are many, and I'm going to briefly list all of them here so you get a sense of the scope of the topic. The first is the intangible drilling costs deduction. So in our tax code, fossil fuel companies can actually write off most of the costs from tapping into new wells. So in our capitalist system where business as usual includes fossil fuels, it's intuitive for these companies to say that they had spent a lot of money in tapping new wells and in discovering new sources of energy. And thus that's less money that they should have to owe to the government because it's less money that they're able to pay because they put so much money into their production in the first place. Next, there's the idea of percentage depletion. So this is based on the normal business concept called depreciation, where businesses get tax breaks as the value of their product declines over time. And for fossil fuel companies, it's a set percentage at which production is going to decline over time because fossil fuels are non-renewable resources. So at some point, a well is going to start to run relatively dry than it was before. So they're going to make less money and thus have less money to give to the government. There's also a tax credit for clean coal investment. So this involves carbon capture and storage projects, or the idea that you basically have scrubbers that, for coal, they do this where they try to basically clean out or scrub out the emissions of like nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide that are coming from the tailpipe, or not the tailpipe, but the smokestacks themselves, like the most commonly understood toxic emissions. And the idea would be that you're developing technology to do the same thing for the carbon emissions. So rather than the emissions going into the atmosphere, you're capturing them and storing them underground, let's say. And there are many criticisms of this technology, and you can certainly argue as the affirmative that the amount of money we're giving to carbon capture and storage, or CCS, is a waste of money and only allows the fossil fuel industry to make a PR move where they can claim that they're clean when really fossil fuels are always going to remain dirty energy. Next, there's last in, first out accounting, which is also shortened to LIFO. This allows fossil fuel companies to sell their most recent reserves instead of older ones. So for tax purposes, they can say that their costs were higher, and hence that they have to pay less because they're reporting less profit to the government in terms of revenue minus cost. Whereas traditionally, you assume with most businesses that the stuff that they've acquired earlier is going to be sold first. Fossil fuel companies are instead saying that the most recently acquired product for them is what they're going to be selling first. So there's a bunch of stock of theirs, of resources they're just holding on to. So next is the foreign tax credit. So when fossil fuel companies pay foreign governments a fee for extracting oil and gas on their foreign lands, they can actually deduct that from their American income taxes. So they're not double taxed. There's also master limited partnerships. This is a corporate structure for the fossil fuel industry where instead of a traditional publicly traded company, you have a general partner that manages day-to-day operations, and then you have limited partners that give the company capital. And on a quarterly basis, the company distributes all remaining cash back to those limited partners as capital. So rather than having dividends and then the company keeping a portion of cash to reinvest, it's like a constant stream of investment and return for these limited partners. And the general partner is compensated based on how well the company is doing. What this basically enables them to do, and I don't even understand this completely, is just that they can avoid paying corporate income tax because it's not a traditional company structure. And fossil fuel and real estate companies are allowed to take advantage of this in the tax code, but renewable energy companies are not. Um, there are two more important subsidies to think about. First is cheap leases for drilling on federally owned land. So the federal government sells to oil, gas, and coal companies the right to go into federally owned public land and drill there if they think that there are important reserves. In an extreme case, this would involve, say, mining in the national parks, but this is for federally owned land that is owned for the purpose of energy production. And David Roberts gives one example of low-cost leasing of coal production in the Powder River Basin. So this is part of Montana and Wyoming, where 40% of coal in the U.S. comes from, and this is federally owned land. Last is the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. So this is a subsidy for consumption to help poorer families be able to afford the cost of heating. So you could certainly have a negative arguing that they can agree on eliminating all the other subsidies, but this one. And in case you may be wondering, how do I justify, ending low-income heating assistance? I think your push instead is to argue that this program would still exist. It's just that it would have to shift toward electric heating and clean alternatives rather than dissolving the whole premise of low-income heating assistance. You could certainly argue that that would be normal means, especially as the funds for this program are being used by certain local and state partners for the purpose of clean energy. And as clean energy becomes more prominent, that's naturally what they're going to do. So the reason why that lengthy overview of all the subsidies that exist is important is because that gives you the sense of kind of all of the different mechanisms by which the fossil fuel industry is supported by government, and that helps understand not only the fact that these companies don't exist in a purely free market, and if anything, it's a form of state-supported capitalism, which is also called neoliberalism. But there's also the case to be made that by ending fossil fuel subsidies, you really are striking at the heart of the financial viability of coal, oil, and gas. So if you were to eliminate these subsidies, that could create a sea change in the market. The negative could certainly say that would lead to a short-term crisis or shock where suddenly we aren't able to produce enough energy. But the affirmative could say that renewables are capable of providing 100% of our energy needs, and they're making their way in leaps and bounds across the market. But by ending subsidies, they have a fair ability to compete. So I'm just going to conclude with a series of case ideas. The first for the AF would be a plan about LIFO. So you would argue that the last in, first out accounting method, which is pretty much used primarily for fossil fuels in the United States, is inconsistent with the international financial reporting standards, where countries, including the ones recently in the EU that joined onto these standards, are opposed to using LIFO. And you could argue that the US, in order to be competitive in a global economy, needs to participate in this standardization of financial transparency and accountability rather than allowing fossil fuel companies to essentially cheat the tax code and engage in financial schemes. So this would be based with a utilitarian framework arguing about the value of U.S. economic competitiveness for overall prosperity or for American power and hegemony to create global stability. So the second affirmative would be one about climate change. So you would say that fossil fuel subsidies prop up coal, oil, and gas, which accelerates climate change, and only by ending fossil fuel subsidies could renewable energy like wind, solar, and biomass gain a larger market share. This could be read with a utilitarian framework, but also one rooted in environmental ethics. So you could argue certainly that we have moral obligations to protect nature and the environment, and that fossil fuels are antithetical to this. You could even use Kantianism to support this by arguing that based upon a Kantian view of equal freedom, that if we're all to have an equal property right in nature, we should not undermine environmental sustainability because that'll hinder the ability of others to take from nature what they need. So it's basically that everybody should have an equal stake in natural resources, and that environmental damage undermines the ability of communities to be able to freely take from nature and be sustained by it. Um, so the third affirmative that you could look at is one based upon anti-capitalist action. So based on Andreas Malm's book called Fossil Capital, where he says that capitalism's historical development is inextricable from the use of fossil fuels, and you could say that ending fossil fuels is a starting point to a transition to eco-socialism, where we would have an economy that distributes resources via rational planning toward human needs, but also acknowledges environmental scarcity and how we have to live within our means and regulate consumption and make sure that we are not destroying the environment that sustains marginalized communities and workers, because capitalism is built upon treating nature as a free resource or an externality, because the environment is not a party to any contracts that are made between fossil fuel companies and consumers and other sectors of the economy. So the environment gets left out in these financial transactions and in the endless pursuit of profit. There's also a libertarianism affirmative. This is the total ideological opposite of the affirmative I just described. This says that subsidies lead to market distortion because they pick winners and losers rather than allowing companies to actually compete within a free market with a limited government. Another variation on this is an article from Ole Tortman, or Ole, O-L-L-E, called Libertarianism and Climate Change, where he argues that from the libertarian perspective of the non-aggression principle, which is that you should never restrict somebody's liberties without their consent, that nobody consents to the luxury emissions that harm nature and harm the rights of other people by reducing the quality of their life, given that in one sense we all inevitably produce emissions in order to survive, but no one would freely consent to the damages that are done by an excess of emissions that contributes to climate change. Lastly, one affirmative to look at would be based in virtue ethics. So this is a philosophy based upon individual character, and Zachary Allison argues for the virtue of holism, which is understanding that as human beings, we are limited and we rely upon nature and cannot separate ourselves from the environment, which means that we ought to respect the environment as much as we would respect human beings, and therefore we should not ethically endorse fossil fuel production or give taxpayer money towards that. So this could be a non-consequentialist position because you could argue that even if there might be a short-term economic crisis, that we can't sacrifice our values or we can't sacrifice nature for the sake of human well-being or for material goods. So now there are a variety of negative positions that are both consequentialist and non-consequentialist. One of the non-consequentialist ones would be an NC that you could call energy realism. That's the phrase used by Monica Ehrman, who says that Kant's theory of the rational world justifies this idea that there is a single human reality, and then from this thesis argues for a notion of Kantian pragmatism by saying that we can't just keep all fossil fuels in the ground, that we inevitably have to use oil and gas right now in order to resolve energy scarcity that would occur from just ending all supports for fossil fuels, and ultimately suggests that by accepting this reality, we can still promote effective climate solutions like energy efficiency or a carbon tax. But the idea here is that you would be arguing for a sort of pragmatism that fossil fuels are inevitable and necessary based upon these original Kantian premises about reason and the world, rather than just a utilitarian position like an energy poverty dissent. There are also a series of, speaking of disadvantages, one of them would be based upon the electric grid. And you could concede the affirmative's position that there will be an increase in renewable energy and say that the more we rely on wind and solar, the more vulnerable our electric grid will be because of the intermittency of wind and solar, like what happens when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. And then there will be major blackouts where people will lose electricity and society will fall apart. Of course, the affirmative has a really effective response to this about recent innovations in batteries that enable renewable companies to store and transfer the energy from solar and wind when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. But certainly there are cards for the negative on this that are well written. There's also the econ disadvantage again about the centrality of fossil fuel revenue to the economy and how fossil fuels support other sectors. So ultimately, by pulling out the rug from oil, coal, and gas, the economy will take an enormous hit. Of course, the affirmative can say that wind and solar are producing a lot more jobs right now, and that it's really just about shifting from dirty to clean production, not having less growth or less production. Next, there's the managerialism critique. So this is rooted in Martin Heidegger's understanding of the environment in The Question Concerning Technology, where he had argued, and then others later, like Liddell McWhorter, that environmental destruction is rooted in this metaphysical idea that human beings have, that nature is just this inert mass that's meant to be controlled by us for our needs. And McWhorter argues that attempts to guilt people into protecting the environment are based upon this illusion of control, or the idea that we can manage ourselves and we can manage nature in order to deal with ongoing environmental crises, when really we're limited in our ability to do that. That you could couple this with an idea that at some level climate change is inevitable and we're past the point of no return, and that we've waited too long to do anything about climate change and need to let go of the idea that we can solve it. This is a very pessimistic position, but it's certainly one where you could say that the affirmative sounding the alarm bell about ending fossil fuel subsidies is past the point where it could have succeeded, and that instead we have to attune ourselves to the limits of our ability to shape external reality, and also to the sense that critiquing the idea that the environment exists for us rather than as an independent entity that deserves value and its own right to exist. So this is another variation on the argument, where if the affirmative's not arguing for environmental ethics and just makes a utilitarian move to say that climate change is bad because it harms human beings, that still creates a separation between human beings and nature, where we think that human beings are the ethical agents that deserve our respect and that nature only exists for us. When by treating nature as a resource, we get into the mindset that treats human beings as resources, and therefore we have to let go of control and let go of this domineering mindset as a whole. Um, Lastly, you could have a negative case rooted in Rawlsian thought about the veil of ignorance and how if we don't know our socioeconomic position or any other facets of our identity, and we're designing a society, we would agree to protect the least well-off members of society. And that from that basis, we ought to maintain something like the low-income heating assistance program because that benefits the least well off socioeconomically. Of course, climate change also harms the least well off by marginalizing the poor, and progressively decreasing crop yields, say, leading to famines, droughts, sea level rise. All of this displaces the poorest and most vulnerable people, especially in the global south. So maybe that's not the most effective position, but nonetheless, there's certainly an opportunity. So, in summary, there are a lot of really unique positions on this topic, and that's why this topic analysis has run longer than traditionally speaking. So, even though the topic is terse, it has a lot to unpack, and that's why these debates are going to be really exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how these arguments develop. So again, I'm Adam, signing off, and definitely check out the Champion Briefs November-December brief, because the evidence in there will really excellently prepare you for your upcoming debates. Thank you.